Welcome, gentle souls. Welcome to a sanctuary where ancient wisdom meets peaceful rest. Tonight we embark on a journey through time itself, traveling back through centuries to discover the profound stories that shaped Buddhist history. These are not mere historical accounts, but living narratives that carry within them the seeds of deep tranquility and lasting peace. As you settle into this moment, allow your body to find its natural rhythm of rest. There is nowhere else you need to be, nothing else you need to accomplish. Simply let these ancient tales wash over you like gentle waves upon a distant shore, carrying away the tensions of your day and replacing them with the timeless serenity that has comforted countless souls across the ages. The stories we will explore together span over 2.5 millennia, beginning in the royal courts of ancient India and flowing like a great river across continents and cultures. Each tale holds within it a key to understanding not just the historical and Buddha and his followers, but the very nature of peace itself. These are stories of transformation, of ordinary human beings discovering extraordinary truths, of kingdoms changed by the power of compassion, and of wisdom that transcends the boundaries of time and culture. Tonight, we begin our journey in the ancient kingdom of Kapilavastu, in what is now Nepal, where over 2,500 years ago, a prince born who would change the spiritual landscape of our world forever. But this is not the story you might expect. This is the deeper story, the human story of Siddhartha Gautama before he became the Buddha. The palace walls of Kapilavastu rose majestically against the Himalayan foothills, their golden stones catching the first light of dawn. Within walls lived the said Prince Siddhartha, surrounded by every conceivable luxury and pleasure that the ancient world could provide. His father, King Suddhodana, had created what he believed to be a perfect world for his son, a realm where suffering could not enter, and where every desire could be fulfilled. The king's love for his son was profound, yet it was born from a prophecy that filled his heart with both pride and terror. Holy men had foretold that the young prince would become either a great world ruler or a great spiritual teacher who would renounce the world entirely. Determined that his son would follow the path of kingship, Suddhodana crafted an existence of unparalleled beauty and comfort. Gardens bloomed eternally within the palace grounds, tended by the most skilled gardeners who ensured that no flower ever wilted in the prince's sight. Musicians filled the halls with melodies that spoke only of joy and celebration. Dancers moved like flowing water through the courtyards, their movements expressing nothing but grace and happiness still. The phoenix adorned the prince's body. The most exquisite foods graced his table, and every moment was designed to convince him that this protected world was all that existence had to offer. Yet within Prince Siddhartha's heart, something stirred that no amount of luxury could quiet. Even surrounded by such magnificence, he found himself gazing beyond the palace walls, wondering what lay in the world his father had so carefully hidden from him. His questioning mind, the very quality that would one day lead him to enlightenment, began to awaken even in these early years of sheltered comfort. The prince's education was as carefully orchestrated as every other aspect of his life. The wisest teachers in the kingdom were brought to instruct him in the arts of warfare, statecraft, philosophy, and literature. He excelled in all these disciplines, showing a natural aptitude that pleased his father immensely. Yet with each lesson, with each new piece of knowledge, Siddhartha's curiosity about the world beyond his golden cage only grew stronger. His instructors spoke of distant lands, of different peoples, of the great questions that had occupied philosophers for generations. They taught him about governance and the responsibilities of a ruler to his subjects. But in all their teachings, they carefully omitted any mention of the harsher realities of human existence. Pain, sickness, aging, and death were topics forbidden within the palace walls. As Siddhartha grew into young manhood, his father arranged for him to marry his beautiful cousin, Yasodhara. Their wedding was celebrated throughout the kingdom with festivals that lasted for days. The young couple appeared perfectly matched, both possessed of exceptional beauty, intelligence, and refinement. Their love was genuine and deep, adding another golden thread to the tapestry of the prince's seemingly perfect existence. When their son Rahula was born, King Suddhodana felt his plan had reached its culmination. Surely now, with a wife and child to anchor him, Siddhartha would settle into his role as crown prince and eventual king. The birth was celebrated with great joy throughout the palace, and for a time it seemed that the king's careful strategy had succeeded. The prince appeared content, devoted to his family, and ready to accept his destiny as a ruler. Yet the very qualities that made Siddhartha such a promising future king, his deep compassion for others, his thoughtful nature, and his genuine desire to understand truth, were the same qualities that made his current existence feel increasingly hollow. He began to experience what we might call a divine discontent, a restlessness that no amount of pleasure or comfort could satisfy. The prince started taking long walks in the palace gardens at dawn before the carefully choreographed activities of the day began. In these quiet moments, surrounded by the artificial perfection his father had created, he found himself asking questions that had no easy answers. Why did he feel empty despite having everything? What was the purpose of a life devoted solely to pleasure and comfort? What responsibilities did he have to the people beyond these walls? People whose lives he would one day govern, but whom he had never seen. His attendants noticed these changes in their prince. They saw him gazing thoughtfully at the sky, observed his growing quietness during the entertainments that once delighted him, and sensed his increasing desire to venture beyond the palace grounds. Some whispered among themselves, wondering if the old prophecy was beginning to fulfill itself. Others, loyal to the king's vision, redoubled their efforts to distract the prince with new pleasures and diversions. But Siddhartha's awakening consciousness could not be deterred by external distractions. The questions that arose within him were not intellectual puzzles to be solved through clever reasoning. They were existential inquiries that demanded direct experience and honest encounter with reality. No amount of philosophical discussion or artistic beauty could satisfy this deeper hunger for truth. The prince began to request permission to leave the palace and see his future kingdom. Each time, his father found reasons to delay or deny these requests. There were always pressing matters of state, important ceremonies to attend, or seasonal festivals that required the prince's presence. King Suddhodana's anxiety grew as his son's requests became more frequent and more insistent. Finally, after months of gentle but persistent requests, desire Siddhartha's to see the world beyond the palace walls became impossible to ignore. The prince's questions had evolved from inquiries into curious, something approaching demands. He needed to understand the lives of the people he was destined to rule. How could he govern wisely without knowing their experiences, their challenges, their joys and sorrows? Recognizing that continued refusal might drive his son to more drastic measures, King Suddhodana reluctantly agreed to arrange a carefully controlled excursion. But true to his protective nature, He orchestrated this outing with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized every aspect of Siddhartha's upbringing. The king's servants were sent ahead along the planned route to ensure that only healthy, happy, young people would be visible to the prince. Any signs of poverty, sickness, or distress were to be carefully hidden. The streets were cleaned and decorated, the buildings freshly painted, and the people instructed to appear in their finest clothes, displaying nothing but joy and contentment. The royal chariot was prepared with the utmost care, its goldenished to mirror wheels, pole brightness, its silk cushions arranged for maximum comfort. The finest horses in the royal stables were selected to draw the chariot, and the prince's most trusted charioteer, a man named Channa, who had been his companion since childhood, was chosen to drive. On the appointed morning, as the sun rose over the Himalayan peaks, Prince Siddhartha prepared for his first journey beyond the palace walls. He dressed in simple but elegant clothing, choosing garments that would not immediately mark him as royalty, hoping to see his people as they truly were, rather than as they might perform for a prince. As the chariot rolled gates forward through the palace the first time in Siddhartha's adult life, the prince felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The world beyond those walls had existed in his imagination for so long, built from fragments of stories and glimpses caught from high palace windows. Now he would finally see it with his own eyes. The carefully prepared route took them through the most prosperous districts of the kingdom. The streets bustled with apparently happy citizens going about their daily business. Merchants displayed their wares in colorful markets, children played in clean courtyards, and everywhere there were signs of prosperity and contentment. For a while, it seemed that the world beyond the palace was indeed as perfect as the world within it. Siddhartha observed everything with intense curiosity, asking Channa countless questions about what they saw. The charioteer, loyal to the king's instructions, provided cheerful explanations for everything, painting a picture of a kingdom blessed with perfect happiness and prosperity. The prince felt a sense of relief and satisfaction, believing future that his subjects lived lives as comfortable and joyful as his own. But as their journey continued, something began to shift in Siddhartha's perception. Perhaps it was the very artificiality of the perfection he witnessed, or perhaps it was simply that truth has a way of revealing itself despite our best efforts to hide it. The prince's keen observation began to notice subtle details that didn't quite fit the picture of universal happiness being presented to him. He saw how quickly people looked away when his chariot approached, noticed the practiced nature of their smiles, observed the way conversations seemed to stop and restart past. As they, his intuitive wisdom, already awakening within him, sensed that something essential was being hidden from his view. And then, despite all the king's careful preparations, destiny intervened in the form of what Buddhist history calls the four sights. These encounters would shatter Siddhartha's protected worldview and set in motion the events that would transform him from a sheltered prince into the Buddha, the awakened one, whose teachings would bring peace to countless beings across the centuries. The first sight appeared as to corner into they turned that high a street, not been as thoroughly prepared as the others. There, leaning heavily on a walking stick, was an elderly man whose body bore all the unmistakable signs of advanced age. His back was bent, his hair white and thin, his skin wrinkled and weathered by decades of living. He moved slowly and with obvious difficulty, each step requiring careful effort. Siddhartha had never seen anything like this before. In the palace, only young and healthy people were allowed his presence. The sight of this elderly man stopped him completely, and he asked Channa to halt the chariot. "What has happened to this person?" the prince asked, his voice filled with genuine concern and bewilderment. "Why does he move with such difficulty? Why does his body appear so different from ours?" Channa found himself caught between his loyalty to the king's instructions and his deeper loyalty to the prince himself. He had known Siddhartha since childhood and could see the profound impact this encounter was having on his friend. After a moment of internal struggle, he chose truth over deception. "My prince," Channa said gently, "this is what we call old age. All living beings, if they are fortunate enough to live long, will experience this transformation of the body. The strength of youth fades, the skin changes, and movement becomes more difficult. This man was once young and strong, just as we are now." The prince sat in stunned silence, absorbing this revelation. The concept of aging was entirely foreign to his experience, yet something deep within him recognized its truth. He watched the elderly man continue his slow journey down the street, each labored step a testament to the reality that Channa had just revealed. "Does this happen to everyone?" Siddhartha asked quietly. "Yes, my prince, to everyone who lives long enough. Your father, your mother, yourself, and I. If we are blessed with long life, we will all experience this change." For several long minutes, the prince remained silent, his mind grappling with this newfound knowledge. The artificial perfection of his world had been pierced by a single glimpse of reality's deeper truth. Finally, he instructed Channa to continue their journey. But the carefree curiosity with which they had begun was now replaced by something more profound. The beginning of genuine questioning about the nature of existence itself. They traveled further through the city, but now Siddhartha's eyes were open in a new way. He began to notice details that had previously escaped his attention. The slight stoop in a woman's shoulders, the careful way an older merchant counted his coins, the protective way families gathered around their elderly members. The reality of aging once revealed seemed to be everywhere. As they rounded another corner, approaching what should have been the final district of their carefully planned route, a second sight appeared that would deepen Siddhartha's awakening even further. A crowd had gathered around someone lying by the roadside, their faces filled with concern and compassion. Despite Channa's attempts to steer the chariot away, the prince insisted they stop to investigate. What he saw challenged his understanding of human existence even more profoundly than the sight of the elderly man had done. A young person, perhaps no older than Siddhartha himself, lay writhing in obvious pain. Their body was racked with fever, their skin pale and covered in perspiration. Family members knelt beside them, offering water and comfort, but their expressions revealed a helplessness that cut straight to the prince's heart. "What afflicts this person?" Siddhartha asked, though part of him already sensed that he was about to learn of another fundamental aspect of life that had been hidden from him. Channa's voice was heavy with reluctance as he answered, "This is sickness, my prince. Disease can strike any person at any time, regardless of age or station. The body, which seems so strong and reliable, can be overcome by illness that causes great suffering." The prince watched as those surrounding the sick person tried desperately to provide relief, their love and care evident in every gesture. Yet despite their efforts, the suffering continued. Here was another truth about existence that his protected upbringing had concealed from him. The reality that even young, healthy bodies could be overcome by forces beyond their control. "Can this happen to anyone?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Yes, my prince. Sickness does not distinguish between rich and poor, young and old, royal and common. It is a reality that touches all lives. As they prepared to leave this scene of suffering, Siddhartha found himself changed once again. The comfortable certainties of his sheltered existence were crumbling, replaced by a growing awareness of vulnerabilities and challenges he had never imagined. The perfect world his father had created suddenly seemed not just artificial, but almost cruel in its denial of these fundamental truths. Their journey continued, but now both prince and charioteer traveled in contemplative silence. The carefully arranged displays of happiness and prosperity they passed seemed hollow and meaningless in light of these new revelations. Siddhartha found himself looking more deeply into the faces they encountered, searching for signs of the hidden realities he was beginning to understand. It was as they were making their way back toward the palace that the third sight appeared, one that would complete the shattering of Siddhartha's protected worldview. A funeral procession was making its way slowly down a side street, impossible to avoid despite all of the king's careful planning. The sight stopped Siddhartha completely. A body lay motionless on a simple stretcher, covered with a white cloth. Around it, people wept openly, their grief raw and undisguised. Some threw flowers, others chanted prayers, but all were united in an expression of loss so profound that it seemed to fill the very air around them. "What has happened here?" the prince asked, though his heart already knew this was something final and irreversible. Channa looked at his childhood friend, seeing the innocence that was about to be lost forever. "This is death, my prince. The person who once lived in that body has departed, never to return. This is the fate that awaits every living being, the final separation from everything and everyone they have known and loved." The words hit Siddhartha like a physical blow. Death, the ultimate reality that his father had worked so desperately to hide from him. As he watched the funeral procession pass, the prince understood that everything he had taken for granted, his own life, the lives of his beloved wife and child, the existence of his parents and friends, was temporary. Of it would all one day come to this same end. "Everyone," he whispered, "everyone, my prince. This is the one certainty in life, that it will end." For a long time, Siddhartha sat motionless in the chariot, watching until the funeral procession disappeared from sight. The three sights he had witnessed, old age, sickness, and death, had revealed to him the fundamental challenges that every human being must face. The protected paradise of his upbringing now seemed not just naive, but somehow honest, deeply dish, as they finally began their journey back to the palace. The prince's mind was consumed with questions that demanded answers. If aging, sickness, and death were inevitable aspects of human existence, what was the point of the comfortable life he had been living? How could anyone find genuine peace and happiness knowing these realities awaited them? What was the purpose of existence if it was destined to end in suffering and loss? The golden walls of the palace came into view, but they no longer represented security and comfort to Siddhartha. Instead, they seemed like barriers preventing him and others from confronting the most important questions life had to offer. He realized that his father's loving protection had actually been a form of spiritual imprisonment, keeping him from the very experiences and knowledge he needed to understand his purpose in the world. That evening, as he rejoined his family for their customary meal together, Siddhartha found it impossible to participate in the light-hearted conversation and gentle entertainments that had once brought him joy. His wife, Yasodhara, sensitive to his changing mood, asked if something had troubled him during his journey beyond the palace walls. How could he explain what he had discovered? How could he share the weight of understanding heart The sight that now presses upon his beautiful young wife and infant son, both so precious to him, was now tinged with the terrible knowledge that aging, sickness, and death would one day touch them as well. The very love he felt for them had become a source of anxiety rather than simple joy. That night, sleep eluded the prince entirely. He found himself walking the moonlit corridors of the palace, each familiar tapestry and golden ornament now seeming to mock him with their false promises of permanence. The very beauty that had once comforted him now felt like an elaborate deception, hiding truths that every human being deserved to understand. As dawn approached, painting the sky in soft pastels above the Himalayan peaks, Siddhartha made his way to the palace gardens where he had spent so many contemplative mornings. But this time, his solitude was interrupted by an unexpected encounter that would provide the final catalyst for his spiritual transformation. There, seated beneath a flowering tree in perfect stillness, was a figure unlike any the prince had ever seen. The man wore simple robes of faded saffron. His head was shaven, and his face radiated a peace so profound that it seemed to transform the very air around him. Despite possessing nothing more than a simple begging bowl, this wandering monk appeared to embody a contentment that all of Siddhartha's wealth and privilege had failed to provide. This was the fourth sight, the vision that would complete the prince's awakening to his true calling. Here was living proof that it was possible to find peace even while fully acknowledging the harsh realities of existence. The monk had not hidden from old age, sickness, and death, yet he radiated a serenity that transcended these inevitable sufferings. Approaching carefully, Siddhartha spoke softly to avoid disturbing the monk's meditation. When the holy man opened his eyes, they held a depth of compassion and understanding that immediately captivated the prince. "Forgive my," Siddhartha said, "intrusion. But I must ask you something. Yesterday I learned for aging, sickness, and death. The first time about these discoveries have to my core. Yet taken me you sit here with such peace, such evident contentment. How is this possible when such suffering awaits us all?" The monk smiled with infinite gentleness. "Young man, I have indeed seen all these things you speak of. I have watched loved ones grow old, fall ill, and pass away. I have experienced these challenges in my own body and mind, but I have also discovered something else, a truth that lies beyond these temporary conditions of existence." "What truth?" Siddhartha asked, his heart racing with anticipation. "The truth that suffering, while real, is not the final word about our existence. There is a peace that can be found even in the midst of life's challenges, an understanding that transforms our relationship with aging, sickness, and death. This peace comes not from avoiding these realities, but from seeing through them to something deeper and more enduring." The monk's words resonated in Siddhartha's heart like a bell struck a silent temple. Here was the answer he had been seeking without even knowing the question. There was a path beyond the comfortable illusions of palace life, beyond the despair that came from simply acknowledging suffering. There was a way to find genuine peace that did not depend on external circumstances or the denial of difficult truths. "How does one discover this peace?" the prince asked urgently. "Through the path of spiritual inquiry, through meditation and contemplation, through releasing attachment to the temporary things of this world, while cultivating compassion for all beings who suffer. It requires leaving behind the distractions and comforts that prevent us from seeing clearly, and dedicating oneself completely to understanding the deepest truths of existence." As the morning sun climbed higher, the monk rose gracefully from his seated position. "I must continue on my way, but remember this: the peace you seek is not found in any palace or possession. It is discovered through the courageous willingness to face life as it truly is, and in that facing, to find the liberation that has always been your birthright." With these words, the monk walked slowly away, leaving Siddhartha alone with a decision that would change the course of history. The prince now understood that his comfortable life in the palace was not just meaningless, but actively preventing him from discovering his true purpose. The path forward was clear, it though would require sacrifices that seemed almost unbearable. Over the following days, Siddhartha found himself unable to return to the routines that had once structured his existence. The entertainments felt hollow, the luxurious meals tasted like ash, and even the loving presence of his wife and child, while still precious to him, could not quiet the urgent calling that now consumed his every waking moment. He began to spend longer periods in solitude, contemplating the choice that lay before him. He could remain in the palace, accepting his role as future king, marrying his knowledge of suffering to life of comfortable denial. Or he could follow the example of the monk he had encountered, leaving everything behind to search for the deeper truth that could bring genuine peace not just to himself, but potentially to all beings who suffered. The weight of this decision was almost crushing. To leave would mean abandoning his beloved family, disappointing his devotee, and turning father his back on the responsibilities and privileges of his royal birth. Yet to stay would mean betraying the profound calling that had awakened within him, denying the urgent need to fin questions of human answers to the fundamental existence. His wife, Yasodhara, with the intuitive wisdom of deep love, sensed the internal struggle consuming her husband. One evening, as they sat together in their private chambers watching their infant son sleep, she spoke the words that both of them had been avoiding. "You're going to leave, aren't you?" she said quietly, her voice carrying both sorrow and understanding. Siddhartha looked into her eyes, seeing there a depth of compassion that matched his own. "How can you know this when I have barely admitted it to myself?" "Because I know your heart," she replied. "I have watched you these past days, seen the way you look at our son and at me, as if you are already saying goodbye. I have observed your restlessness, your inability to find peace in the life we have built together. And because I love you, I recognize that something is calling you beyond what this palace can provide." Tears flowed down the prince's face as he realized that his wife understood him better than he had understood himself. "I don't know how to choose between love and truth, between my responsibility to you and Rahula, and my responsibility to seek the answers that might help all beings find peace." Yasodhara reached out and took his hand, her touch conveying a love so profound that it transcended personal desire. Perhaps the greatest love is sometimes letting go. Perhaps your responsibility to us and to all beings is the same responsibility, to find the truth that can end suffering for everyone. That night, as his family slept peacefully beside him, Siddhartha made his decision. He would leave the palace and undertake the spiritual quest that had been calling to him. But he would not go selfishly or carelessly. He would dedicate his search not just to his own liberation, but to finding a path that could bring peace to his beloved family, to his devoted father, and to all beings who struggled with the fundamental challenges of existence. The prince spent his final night in the palace moving quietly through the rooms and gardens that had sheltered his entire life. He visited the chamber where his parents slept, offering them silent gratitude for their love and protection, even as he prepared to move beyond the limitations of that protection. He stood for a long time beside the bed where his wife and infant son lay sleeping, memorizing their faces and promising in his heart that whatever he discovered on his spiritual journey would ultimately serve their highest good. As the first light of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon, Prince Siddhartha made his way to the palace stables, where his faithful horse Kanthaka waited. His charioteer Chana, sensing something momentous in his friend's demeanor, asked no questions as he prepared the horse for travel. Together, they rode silently through the palace gates for what Siddhartha knew would be the last time. Unlike his previous journey beyond the walls, this departure was not sanctioned or carefully planned by his father. This was an act of spiritual rebellion, a choice to embrace uncertainty and hardship in pursuit of ultimate truth. As they reached the forest that bordered his father's kingdom, Siddhartha dismounted from his horse and removed the silk robes that marked his royal status. In their place, he donned the simple saffron garments of a wandering seeker. With his sword, he cut away his long hair, symbolic of cutting away his attachment to worldly identity and status. Return to the palace, he instructed Channa, his voice firm despite the tears streaming down both men's faces. Tell my father that his son has not abandoned his responsibilities, but has expanded them to include all beings who suffer. Tell my wife that my love for her and our child is so great that I must find the path to end all suffering, so they know that they too might win perfect peace. Channa pleaded with his childhood friend to reconsider, but Siddhartha's resolve was unshakable. The prince who had lived in comfort for 29 years had died in those palace gardens. In his place stood a seeker whose only possessions were his robes, a begging bowl, and an unquenchable determination to find the truth that could liberate all beings from the cycle of suffering. As Channa reluctantly began his journey back to the palace, leading the riderless horse that had carried them both to this moment of transformation, the man who would become the Buddha walked deeper into the forest. Behind him lay everything he had ever known and loved. Ahead lay years of hardship, uncertainty, and spiritual seeking that would test every aspect of his being. But in his heart burned a flame of compassion so bright that it illuminated the path forward. He had seen suffering, and he had glimpsed the possibility of its end. Now he would dedicate his life to bridging that gap, to finding the way from one to the other, not just for himself, but for all beings who shared in the universal experiences of aging, sickness, death, and the deep longing for lasting peace. The great renunciation was complete. The sheltered prince had become a homeless wanderer, trading silk for rough cloth, palaces for forests, certainty for faith in the possibility of awakening. The journey toward Buddhahood had begun, carrying within it the seeds of a teaching that would offer comfort and guidance to countless souls across the centuries, including those who would hear these very stories on quiet nights, more than 2,000 years in the future. As Siddhartha disappeared into the dappled shadows of the ancient forest, the morning sun climbed higher into a sky that seemed to whisper of transformations yet to come, of truths waiting to be discovered, and of a peace that would one day embrace the world. The forest welcomed Siddhartha with a silence deeper than any he had known within palace walls. Here, beneath canopies of ancient trees, sunlight filtered through leaves in patterns that shifted like thoughts across the surface of consciousness. The sounds of the royal city faded behind him until only the whisper of wind through branches and the distant call of birds remained to mark the rhythm of this new existence. For the first time in his 29 years, Siddhartha found himself truly alone, stripped of every comfort and certainty that had defined his identity. The simple robes felt rough against skin accustomed to silk. The hard earth beneath his feet reminded him with each step how far he had traveled from marble floors and golden corridors. Yet with each mile deeper into the wilderness, something within him began to stir that had been dormant through all his years of luxury. The first village he encountered taught him lessons that no royal tutor could have provided. As he approached with his begging bowl, uncertain of how to even ask for food, the villagers regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Here was someone whose soft hands and upright bearing betrayed his aristocratic origins, yet who wore the robes of a religious mendicant and carried himself with the humility of one who owned nothing. An elderly woman, bent with years of labor in the fields, studied his face with eyes that had seen countless seasons of hardship and joy. Something in his expression, perhaps the genuine hunger there, not just for food, but for understanding, moved her to offer him a simple bowl of rice and lentils. As Siddhartha received this gift, his first meal as a wandering seeker, tears of gratitude flowed down his cheeks. Never before had food tasted so precious, prepared by hands that knew struggle, offered by a heart that understood genuine need. In that moment, receiving sustenance from someone who possessed so much less than he had ever known, Siddhartha began to understand something profound about the nature of generosity and interdependence. The woman who fed him was wealthy beyond measure in ways that his father's treasury could never match. Word of the mysterious young monk spread through the region, drawing the attention of various spiritual teachers who had established their practices in the forests and caves of the area. In those days, the spiritual landscape of India was rich with seekers and masters, each offering different paths toward liberation from the suffering that seemed inherent in human existence. Siddhartha's first teacher was a renowned sage named Alara Kalama, whose reputation for wisdom had spread throughout the kingdom. This master had achieved extraordinary states of consciousness through meditation, reaching levels of mental absorption that seemed to dissolve the boundaries between self and cosmos. His followers spoke in whispered tones of his ability to remain in meditation for days at a time, his mind resting in dimensions of peace that transcended ordinary awareness. Under Alara Kalama's guidance, Siddhartha discovered that his mind possessed a natural aptitude for the deepest forms of concentration. Within weeks, he had mastered meditation techniques that took other students years to achieve. His consciousness learned to move beyond the realm of thoughts and sensations, entering states of such profound stillness that the external world seemed to disappear entirely. Yet even as Siddhartha achieved these extraordinary states of mental absorption, something within him recognized that this was not the ultimate answer he sought. These experiences, however blissful and peaceful, were temporary. When he emerged from the deepest meditative states, the fundamental questions about aging, sickness, and death remained unanswered. The suffering he had witnessed in the world was not eliminated, merely temporarily transcended. When Siddhartha shared these observations with Alara Kalama, the master was both impressed by his student's insight and saddened by his departure. Few students had achieved such mastery so quickly, and even fewer had possessed the wisdom to recognize the limitations of that achievement. As they parted ways, Alara Kalama blessed his former student with words that would prove prophetic. "You seek something beyond what I can teach," the master said, placing his hands on Siddhartha's head in blessing. "May you find that which surpasses all the states of consciousness I have shown you, And when you do, may you remember those of us who are still seeking. Siddhartha's journey continued to the hermitage of Uddaka Ramaputta, another renowned teacher whose approach to liberation involved even more refined states of consciousness. Under this master's guidance, Siddhartha plunged into meditation practices that dissolved not only the sense of individual self, but even the subtle awareness of existing in any state at all. These were experiences at the very edge of what human consciousness seemed capable of achieving. In the deepest of these states, there was no Siddhartha, no world, no problems to be solved or questions to be answered. There was something so close to complete nothingness that it seemed to offer the ultimate escape from all forms of suffering. Yet, when Siddhartha returned from these profound absorptions, he found that the fundamental issues that had driven him from the palace remained completely unresolved. The villages he encountered still contained elderly people struggling with the limitations of aging bodies. Disease still struck the innocent, death still separated families, and the basic dissatisfaction that seemed to permeate human existence continued unchanged. More troubling still, Siddhartha began to realize that these extraordinary meditative states, however profound, were actually a form of sophisticated escape rather than genuine liberation. They required withdrawing from the world rather than engaging with it wisely. They offered temporary relief from suffering rather than its permanent resolution. When he shared these insights with Uddaka Ramaputta, the master was astounded by his student's perception. Here was someone who had achieved the highest states of consciousness that their tradition knew, yet possessed the clarity to see beyond them. The master offered to make Siddhartha his successor, to place him at the head of his community of practitioners. But Siddhartha knew that his path lay elsewhere. With deep gratitude for all he had learned, he took leave of his second teacher and continued deeper into the forests that had become his home. The months of intensive meditation had taught him much about the capacities of the mind, but had also clarified what he was not seeking. He needed to find a way to address suffering directly rather than simply transcending it temporarily. It was during this period of solitary wandering that Siddhartha encountered a group of 5 ascetics whose approach to spiritual liberation was radically different from anything he had yet experienced. These practitioners, led by an earnest seeker named Kundana, believed that enlightenment could only be achieved through the complete mortification of the body's desires and needs. Their logic seemed compelling to Siddhartha's seeking mind. If attachment to physical comfort and pleasure was a source of suffering, then perhaps the path to freedom lay in systematically eliminating every form of bodily satisfaction. If the comfortable life of the palace had prevented him from seeing truth clearly, then perhaps extreme discomfort would provide the clarity he sought. Under the influence of these 5 companions, Siddhartha embarked upon a program of austerities that tested the very limits of human endurance. He reduced his food intake to a single grain of rice per day, then to a single sesame seed, then to periods of complete fasting that stretched for weeks. His body, once strong and healthy from the finest foods and careful exercise, became skeletal and weak. He practiced holding his breath for extended periods, believing that controlling the life force itself might lead to spiritual breakthrough. He slept on beds of thorns, exposed himself to extremes of heat and cold, and subjected his body to every form of discomfort that his companions suggested might purify his consciousness. The 5 ascetics were amazed by Siddhartha's dedication to these practices. They had never seen anyone pursue self-mortification with such complete commitment. His reputation as a spiritual athlete spread throughout the region, drawing other seekers who came to witness this extraordinary display of religious discipline. For 6 years, Siddhartha continued these extreme practices, pushing his body to the very edge of survival. His hair fell out, his skin became dark and leathery, and his once bright eyes sank deep into their sockets. He became so thin that when he touched his belly, he could feel his spine through his flesh. The handsome prince who had left the palace was now unrecognizable, transformed into a living skeleton whose every movement required tremendous effort. Yet despite this extraordinary commitment to ascetic practice, despite pushing his body beyond what seemed humanly possible, Siddhartha found that enlightenment remained as elusive as ever. The fundamental questions about suffering and its resolution were no closer to being answered. If anything, his extreme physical deprivation had clouded his mind rather than clarifying it. Worse still, he began to realize that this path of extreme asceticism was simply the opposite extreme from the indulgent life he had known in the palace. Both approaches were based on the assumption that his relationship to physical experience held the key to spiritual liberation. Both were forms of obsession with the body, whether through indulgence or denial. One day, as Siddhartha sat in meditation beneath a grove of trees, weakened to the point where he could barely maintain an upright posture, a memory from his childhood arose spontaneously in his consciousness. He recalled a moment from his youth when he had been sitting under a rose apple tree during a royal plowing ceremony, naturally falling into a state of peaceful, joyful concentration. In that childhood memory, his mind had become calm and clear without any effort or force. There had been no struggle, no extreme measures, no attempt to escape from or indulge in physical sensation. There had simply been natural awareness, present and alert, resting in its own inherent peace. The memory came with such vivid clarity that it seemed to illuminate everything wrong with his current approach. Could it be that enlightenment was not something to be achieved through extreme effort, but rather something to be uncovered through balanced awareness? Could the path to liberation lie not in the extremes of indulgence or deprivation, but in a middle way that honored both the body's needs and the mind's natural capacity for wisdom? That same day, as if in response to this dawning insight, a young woman named Sujata appeared along the riverbank where Siddhartha was meditating. She was the daughter of a wealthy family who had been making regular offerings to the tree spirits of the forest, praying for the birth of a child. When she saw the emaciated figure of the ascetic beneath the tree, something in his presence convinced her that he was a deity who had appeared to bless her devotions. Sujata approached with a bowl of rice pudding, prepared with the finest ingredients and cooked with loving care. She offered this nourishment to Siddhartha with hands pressed together in reverence, her eyes shining with the joy of being able to serve what she believed was a divine being. For a moment, Siddhartha hesitated. Accepting this rich food would mean abandoning the extreme ascetic practices that had defined his spiritual identity for 6 years. It would mean disappointing his 5 companions, who would surely see such acceptance as a betrayal of their shared commitment to self-mortification. But as he looked into Sujata's face, radiant with generosity and devotion, and felt the genuine care that had gone into preparing this offering, Siddhartha realized that refusing would be a rejection not just of nourishment, but of the interconnected web of kindness that made spiritual seeking possible. This young woman's gift was an expression of the same Buddha nature that he sought to awaken within himself. With deep gratitude, Siddhartha accepted the bowl of rice pudding. As he ate slowly, feeling strength returning to his weakened body, he understood that he was not betraying his spiritual quest, but rather correcting its course. The middle way between indulgence and deprivation was not a compromise between two extremes, but a recognition of wisdom that transcended both. The five ascetics who had been his companions were indeed shocked and disappointed by what they saw as Siddhartha's spiritual failure. How could someone who had demonstrated such extraordinary commitment to religious discipline now fall back into accepting rich food and physical comfort? They could not understand that their companion had not abandoned his seeking, but had evolved beyond their limited understanding of what seeking meant. "You have given up the path," Kondana said sadly, as the group prepared to leave their former friend behind. "You have chosen comfort over liberation, pleasure over truth. We can no longer consider you a serious spiritual practitioner." As his five companions walked away, their robes disappearing into the forest depths, Siddhartha felt a profound sadness, but also a deeper certainty than he had known in years. He was alone once again, but this solitude felt different from his earlier wandering. Now he was not fleeing from something, but moving toward a discovery that he sensed was very close. That evening, as his body continued to recover from years of extreme deprivation, Siddhartha made his way to a large Bodhi tree whose broad leaves and sturdy trunk seemed to offer the perfect setting for what he knew would be the culmination of his spiritual quest. Something within him recognized that this tree, in this place, at this moment, was where his long journey from palace to forest would reach its resolution. He gathered soft grass to create a simple seat facing east toward the rising sun, and as twilight painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, he settled into a sitting posture with a determination unlike anything he had known before. This would not be another temporary meditation session or experimental spiritual practice. This was a commitment to remain in this spot until he either found the truth he sought or died in the attempt. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky above, Siddhartha closed his eyes and turned his attention inward with the patience and persistence that 6 years of seeking had taught him. But now his approach was different. Instead of forcing his mind into extraordinary states or punishing his body for its needs, he simply observed with clear awareness whatever arose in his consciousness. The sounds of the forest at night formed a gentle background to his meditation. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of night birds, the subtle creaking of branches in the evening breeze, all became part of the vast field of awareness within which his seeking was taking place. He was no longer trying to escape from the world, but to understand his true relationship with it. Hours passed in this way, with Siddhartha maintaining perfect stillness while his mind moved through layer after layer of understanding. Old memories arose and dissolved. Hopes and fears presented themselves for examination, and gradually the mental formations that had shaped his identity began to reveal their impermanent, constructed nature. As the night deepened toward its darkest hour, Siddhartha's awareness began to penetrate into dimensions of understanding that surpassed anything his previous teachers had shown him. But unlike the extraordinary meditative states he had achieved before, these insights did not separate him from ordinary reality. Instead, they illuminated the extraordinary nature of what he had always assumed was ordinary. The process of breathing, which he had taken for granted throughout his life, revealed itself as a miracle of interconnection with all life. The thoughts arising and passing in his mind showed themselves to be not his personal possessions, but temporary formations in the vast ocean of consciousness that connected all beings. Even his own sense of being a separate individual named Siddhartha began to be seen through, like a mirage dissolving under careful examination. What he had taken to be his fixed identity was revealed as a constantly changing process, no more solid or permanent than the patterns of waves on the surface of a river. Yet rather than being frightening, this dissolution of his familiar sense of self came with the most profound peace he had ever experienced. It was as if he had been carrying a tremendous weight throughout his entire life without realizing it. And now that weight was finally being set down. The burden of maintaining and defending a separate self, the exhausting effort of trying to make permanent what was inherently changing, all of this fell away like old clothes being discarded. As the first light of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold, Siddhartha's understanding reached its completion. The truth he had been seeking through all his years of searching was not something to be found in any particular place or achieved through any specific technique. It was the very awareness that had been seeking all along, the consciousness that was present in every moment of experience, whether pleasant or painful, ordinary or extraordinary, the aging, sickness, and death that had first driven him from the palace were revealed not as problems to be solved, but as natural expressions of the impermanent nature of all conditioned existence. The suffering these experiences created came not from the experiences themselves, but from the mind's resistance to their inevitable arising and passing. When this resistance dissolved in the light of clear understanding, what remained was not the absence of experience, but the presence of an unshakable peace that could embrace all experiences without being disturbed by them. This was not the peace of escape or avoidance, but the peace of complete acceptance and profound compassion. As the sun climbed higher into the morning sky, its golden rays filtering through the leaves of the Bodhi tree to create patterns of light and shadow on the ground below, the man who had been Prince Siddhartha, who had become a wandering seeker, now sat as the Buddha, the awakened one, whose understanding would offer hope and guidance to countless beings across the centuries to come. For 7 days and nights, the newly awakened Buddha remained beneath the Bodhi tree, absorbed in the bliss of liberation, marveling at the simplicity of what he had discovered. The truth that had eluded him through years of seeking had been present all along, closer than his own breath, more intimate than his own thoughts. It was the very nature of awareness itself, the Buddha nature that existed within every being, waiting patiently to be recognized. Yet, as the initial bliss of awakening gradually gave way to a deeper consideration of his situation, the Buddha faced a profound dilemma. How could he possibly communicate this understanding to others? The truth he had realized was so simple that it might seem trivial, yet so subtle that it could easily be misunderstood. Would anyone believe that the end of suffering was available through such natural, effortless awareness? The thought of trying to teach this truth to a world caught up in the very delusions he had seen through filled him with compassion and uncertainty in equal measure. Perhaps it would be better to remain in the forest, enjoying the perfect peace of liberation in silence, rather than face the inevitable misunderstandings and resistance that teaching would bring. But as he contemplated this possibility, the faces of all the beings he had encountered during his years of seeking arose in his awareness. He remembered Sujata's generous offering, his father's loving protection, his wife's selfless understanding, the 5 ascetics' sincere if misguided seeking. All of these beings, like himself, were struggling with the fundamental challenges of existence, looking for a way beyond suffering. The Buddha realized that his awakening had not been achieved for his own benefit alone. The understanding he had gained was not a personal possession to be hoarded, but a gift that belonged to all beings who were ready to receive it. His liberation was meaningless if it did not serve the liberation of others. With this recognition came a determination that would shape the remaining 45 years of his life. He would find a way to share this understanding, to create a path that others could follow from the shore of suffering to the shore of perfect peace. The teaching of the Dharma, the great work of awakening, was about to begin. But first, he needed to find the right people to receive these teachings, beings whose minds were ready to hear such profound truths without being overwhelmed or discouraged. As he considered who might be most receptive to his message, the Buddha's thoughts turned to his former teachers, Alara Kalama and Udaka Ramaputta, whose sincere seeking had impressed him even when their methods had proven limited. Extending his awareness to locate these former guides, the Buddha discovered with sadness that both had passed away during his years of extreme asceticism. The opportunity to share his awakening with those who had helped prepare him for it had been lost. This realization deepened his sense of urgency about beginning his teaching mission. His thoughts then turned to the 5 ascetics who had abandoned him when he accepted Sujata's offering. Despite their disappointment in what they had seen as his spiritual failure, the Buddha recognized their genuine dedication to finding truth. Perhaps they would be able to hear his message with the openness that sincere seeking had cultivated within them. Through the extraordinary perception that awakening had made available to him, the Buddha located his former companions in the deer park at Sarnath, a peaceful grove where many spiritual seekers gathered to practice and discuss the deepest questions of existence. It was there that he would deliver his first teaching, setting in motion the wheel of Dharma that would continue to turn for thousands of years. As the Buddha rose from his seat beneath the Bodhi tree for the first time in 7 days, he moved with a grace and presence that seemed to transform the very air around him. The awakening that had taken place in the depths of his being now radiated outward, touching every aspect of his being and everything he encountered. The forest itself seemed to recognize the transformation that had occurred. Birds gathered in the branches above, their songs creating a natural symphony of celebration. Flowers bloomed with unusual brilliance, and even the quality of light filtering through the leaves seemed somehow more luminous and alive. But the Buddha's attention was not caught by these miraculous displays. His focus remained on the vast web of suffering and the equally vast possibility for liberation that his awakening had revealed. Every being he would encounter possessed the same Buddha nature he had realized within himself. Every moment of teaching would be an opportunity to help others recognize their own inherent awakeness. As he began his journey toward Sarnath, walking the dusty paths that connected forest to village to city, the Buddha carried within himself not just personal liberation, but the seeds of a transformation that would eventually touch every corner of the world. The homeless wanderer who had left the palace in search of truth had become something unprecedented, a fully awakened human being whose very existence proved that the end of suffering was not just a beautiful dream, but an achievable reality. The long night of seeking was over. The dawn of teaching was about to begin. And in the walking of those first steps toward Sarnath, toward his former companions, toward the countless beings who would benefit from his understanding, the Buddha began the great work of turning the wheel of Dharma that continues to offer hope and healing to this very day. The journey to Sarnath stretched across landscapes that seemed to mirror the transformation taking place within the Buddha's consciousness. Ancient trade routes wound through valleys where merchants had traveled for generations, carrying not just goods, but stories, hopes, and the endless human search for meaning that transcended material exchange. Each step along these pathways carried the Buddha closer to a moment that would mark the beginning of one of humanity's most profound spiritual traditions. The road itself became a teacher, revealing layers of wisdom that only awakened perception could discern. In the dust beneath his feet, the Buddha saw the remnants of countless journeys, each grain a witness to pilgrims, merchants, families, and seekers who had passed this way before him. The impermanence that had once troubled him as a prince now revealed itself as the very foundation of compassion, for it was this shared vulnerability that connected all beings in their deepest humanity. Villages appeared and disappeared along the route, like thoughts arising and dissolving in meditation. In each settlement, life continued its eternal patterns. Farmers tended their fields with the same careful attention their ancestors had shown for countless generations. Children played games that echoed with laughter, both ancient and eternally new. Elderly people sat in doorways, their weathered faces holding stories of seasons past and wisdom earned through decades of living. Yet now, seeing with awakened eyes, the Buddha perceived in these ordinary scenes something that had been invisible during his years of sheltered palace life. Every smile held within it the seeds of eventual sorrow. Every moment of health carried the inevitability of sickness. Every gathering contained the certainty of future separation. But rather than filling him with despair, this recognition bloomed into an overwhelming compassion that seemed to embrace the entire world. The very suffering that had driven him from his comfortable existence now revealed itself as the doorway to unlimited love. For it was precisely because all beings shared in these fundamental challenges that his heart could open without boundaries or conditions. The old man struggling with his walking stick, the mother comforting her crying child, the merchant worried about his failing business. All were expressions of the same Buddha nature that he had discovered within himself, temporarily obscured but never truly absent. As he walked, the Buddha began to understand that his teaching would need to be like water, taking the shape of whatever container received it. The profound realization that had come to him beneath the Bodhi tree was like the vast ocean of truth, but different beings would need different vessels to receive and hold that truth, according to their capacity and circumstances. For those caught in the extremes of indulgence, he would need to show the peace that came from simplicity and contentment. For those trapped in harsh asceticism, he would demonstrate the wisdom of the middle way that honored both body and spirit. For the intellectually sophisticated, he would offer teachings that satisfied the mind's need for understanding. For the simple-hearted, he would provide practices that spoke directly to their natural wisdom. This recognition brought with it both excitement and trepidation. The responsibility of accurately transmitting such precious understanding felt almost overwhelming. How could he ensure that his words would point others toward their own awakening rather than creating new forms of confusion or attachment? How could he help beings recognize their own inherent freedom without making that freedom into another object to be grasped? The answer came to him as he paused beside a clear stream that flowed alongside the road. Watching the water move naturally around rocks and fallen branches, always finding its way toward the sea, the Buddha understood that his teaching would need to embody the same natural flow. Rather than imposing rigid doctrines or demanding blind faith, he would simply reflect back to each being the truth of their own nature, allowing that recognition to unfold in its own perfect timing. The sun climbed higher as his journey continued, and with it came encounters that began to prepare him for the teaching role he was about to assume. A farmer, struggling to free his cart from mud that had trapped its wheels, looked up as the Buddha approached. Something in the awakened one's presence seemed to calm the man's frustration, and without being asked, the Buddha lent his strength to help push the cart free. No words were exchanged, but the farmer felt something shift within his consciousness as their eyes met in gratitude. The Buddha had offered his first teaching through simple presence and spontaneous compassion, demonstrating that awakening expressed itself not through grand gestures or mystical displays, but through the natural responsiveness of an open heart. A group of children, playing beside a village well, fell silent as the Buddha passed, sensing something extraordinary in his bearing without having words to describe what they perceived. The eldest among them, a girl of perhaps 10 years, approached with the fearless curiosity that belonged to childhood and asked, "Why do you look so peaceful? Even when my grandmother smiles, her eyes still hold sadness. But your eyes hold something different." The Buddha knelt to meet the child at her own level, his face radiating the gentle warmth that would characterize all his interactions with young people throughout his teaching career. "Dear child," he said softly, "perhaps it is because I have learned that the sadness and the joy are both visitors in the house of the heart. When we understand this, we can welcome them both without being afraid." The girl nodded with the immediate understanding that children often possess for profound truths, then ran back to her friends to continue their games. But the Buddha remained kneeling for a moment longer, marveling at how naturally wisdom had flowed in response to sincere questioning. His teaching method was already beginning to reveal itself, not as a predetermined system of beliefs, but as a spontaneous sharing that arose from the meeting of open hearts. As he resumed his journey, the Buddha reflected on the conversation with the child and realized that his approach to teaching would need to honor both the sophisticated philosophical inquiries of learned adults and the direct, innocent questions of young minds. Truth itself was neither complex nor simple, but rather had the quality of water that could nourish both the deepest roots and the most delicate surface growth. The landscape began to change as he drew nearer to Sarnath, the forests giving way to more cultivated areas where communities had established themselves around sources of fresh water and fertile soil. Trade routes converged here, creating a natural gathering place for people from many different regions and walks of life. It was an ideal location for the launch of a teaching that would eventually span continents and cultures. Yet even as anticipation built within him, the Buddha remained grounded in the present moment, fully attentive to each step, each breath, each sensation that arose in his awareness. The extraordinary nature of what he was about to attempt, sharing the direct experience of liberation with beings who had not yet tasted such freedom, required him to remain anchored in the very awakeness he sought to communicate. The afternoon light was beginning to slant toward evening when the Buddha finally reached the outskirts of the deer park at Sarnath. This was a place that had been considered sacred for generations, a grove where both wild animals and human seekers found refuge from the harsh demands of survival. Ancient trees created natural shelters where meditation could be practiced undisturbed, and gentle streams provided the water necessary for sustaining both body and spirit. As he entered the park, the Buddha's awakened perception immediately located his 5 former companions in a secluded grove where they had established their practice. From a distance, he could see that they maintained the same extreme ascetic disciplines that had once defined his own approach to seeking. Their bodies were emaciated, their movements slow and careful, their attention focused inward in the belief that such harsh treatment of physical needs would lead to spiritual breakthrough. A wave of compassion arose in the Buddha's heart as he observed these sincere seekers still trapped in the very methods he had transcended. They were like people digging desperately for water in a dry well, unaware that a fresh spring flowed just beyond their vision. Their dedication was admirable, their sincerity unquestionable. Yet their approach was based on a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of liberation. As he approached their meditation area, the 5 ascetics noticed his presence and initially turned away in disappointment and disapproval. They had invested so much energy in their extreme practices, had made such sacrifices in pursuit of awakening, that accepting the possibility that their approach might be flawed seemed like betraying their entire spiritual identity. "Look who returns," Kondana said to his companions, without looking directly at the Buddha. "The one who abandoned the holy life for comfort and pleasure. What could he possibly have to offer us who have remained faithful to the true path?" But as the Buddha drew closer, something in his presence began to affect them despite their resistance. There was a quality of peace that seemed to radiate from his very being, a depth of contentment that their years of harsh practice had never produced in themselves. His eyes held a clarity that seemed to see through the surface appearances of things to some deeper truth, and his movements carried a natural grace that spoke of complete harmony between body and spirit. Almost involuntarily, the 5 ascetics found themselves rising to greet their former companion, their intended coldness melting in the face of something they recognized but could not name. This was not the defeated seeker they had expected to encounter, someone who had given up the spiritual quest in favor of worldly satisfaction. This was a being who had clearly found what they were all searching for, though by a path they had not imagined possible. "Friends," the Buddha said, his voice carrying both warmth and authority, "I have found what we were all seeking. I have discovered the way beyond suffering, the path to perfect peace. If you are willing to listen, I would like to share with you what has been revealed." The 5 ascetics stood in silence, torn between their preconceptions about spiritual progress and the undeniable evidence of transformation they witnessed before them. Finally, Kondana spoke for the group, his voice holding both skepticism and hope. "You abandoned the ascetic practices that purify consciousness," he said carefully. "You accepted rich food and physical comfort. How can someone who has fallen away from discipline claim to have achieved what we who have remained faithful have not?" The Buddha smiled with infinite patience, recognizing in their questions the same confusion that had once governed his own understanding. "Dear friends, I have not abandoned discipline, but have discovered true discipline. I have not chosen comfort over awakening, but have found the middle way that leads to genuine liberation. The extreme asceticism we practiced together was as much a form of attachment as the luxury I knew in my father's palace." He gestured to a smooth area of ground beneath a large tree, inviting them to sit together as they had during their years of shared seeking. "What I have discovered is not achieved through forcing the mind or punishing the body, but through understanding the nature of suffering itself and the path that leads to its cessation. This understanding is available to anyone willing to see clearly, regardless of their previous practices or apparent failures." The 5 ascetics found themselves drawn to sit as he suggested, their curiosity beginning to overcome their resistance. There was something in the Buddha's manner that commanded attention without demanding submission, that offered profound wisdom while honoring their own intelligence and capacity for understanding. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that filtered through the leaves of their natural shelter, the Buddha prepared to offer his first formal teaching. The moment that would launch the great wheel of Dharma had arrived, carrying within it the potential to transform not just these 5 sincere seekers, but countless beings across future centuries who would hunger for the same liberation. The evening air carried the sounds of the park settling into nighttime rhythms. Animals moved through the underbrush with the quiet confidence of creatures in their natural habitat, while the gentle murmur of streams provided a constant background of natural harmony. It was as if the earth itself was preparing to witness something extraordinary, a transmission of wisdom that would echo through time. The Buddha looked into the faces of his 5 former companions, seeing past their skepticism to the genuine seeking that had brought them to this place. These were beings who had sacrificed comfort, security, and social acceptance in pursuit of truth. Their dedication, however misguided its methods, had prepared them to receive teachings that might be rejected by those too attached to conventional wisdom. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying the natural authority of one who spoke from direct experience rather than theoretical knowledge, "there are 4 truths that I have realized, 4 insights that form the foundation of the path to liberation. These truths are not philosophical concepts to be debated, but realities to be understood and applied in the laboratory of your own experience." The first truth, he explained, was the truth of suffering itself, not as a pessimistic view of existence, but as an honest acknowledgement of the dissatisfaction that pervaded ordinary consciousness. This suffering was not limited to obvious forms of pain like illness, aging, and death, though these were certainly included. It encompassed the subtle but persistent unease that arose from trying to find permanent satisfaction in experiences that were inherently impermanent. As he spoke, the Buddha watched understanding begin to dawn in the eyes of his listeners. They had all experienced this suffering intimately, had felt the frustration of seeking lasting happiness in circumstances that were constantly changing. Their extreme ascetic practices had been motivated by this very recognition, though their response had been based on incomplete understanding. The second truth, he continued, addressed the cause of this suffering. It was not, as they might have assumed, the result of external circumstances or even physical desires themselves. Rather, suffering arose from the mind's habit of clinging, of trying to grasp and hold on to experiences, relationships, and even ideas about oneself. This clinging created a constant tension between what was actually happening and what the mind insisted should be happening. This insight struck the 5 ascetics with particular force, as they recognized how their own spiritual seeking had become a form of clinging to ideas about enlightenment and methods for achieving it. They had been trying to force awakening through willpower and extreme effort, never recognizing that such forcing was itself a form of the very attachment they sought to transcend. The third truth offered hope that had seemed almost too good to believe. This suffering, however deeply entrenched it might appear, was not a permanent condition. The cessation of suffering was not only possible, but was the natural state of awareness when freed from the habits of clinging and resistance. This was not a temporary escape from difficulty, but a fundamental transformation of one's relationship to all experience. As the Buddha described this possibility, something in the hearts of his listeners began to open. They had glimpsed moments of peace in their own practice, brief intervals when the constant struggle seemed to subside. Now, they began to understand that these glimpses were not accidental experiences, but previews of a permanent possibility. The fourth truth provided the practical path for realizing this liberation. It was not a path of extreme indulgence or extreme deprivation. but a middle way that honored both the body's genuine needs and the mind's natural capacity for wisdom. This path involved ethical conduct that created the conditions for mental clarity, meditation practices that developed concentrated awareness, and the cultivation of wisdom that saw through the illusions that created suffering. As the Buddha outlined this eightfold path in detail, describing how right understanding, intention, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration worked together as a complete system for transformation, the five ascetics felt something shift within their consciousness. This was not just another spiritual theory or set of practices to be added to their collection of techniques. This was a living path that addressed their deepest questions and offered practical steps for their resolution. The teaching continued long into the night, with the Buddha responding to their questions with patience and clarity that revealed the depth of his understanding. Every inquiry they raised was met with explanations that satisfied both their intellectual needs and their intuitive wisdom. Gradually, their skepticism dissolved into recognition, then into profound gratitude. By the time dawn began to touch the eastern horizon, painting the sky in soft pastels that filtered through the leaves of their shelter, something unprecedented had occurred. Kondana, the eldest and most cautious of the five ascetics, experienced a moment of direct insight that confirmed everything the Buddha had been teaching. In that instant, he saw through the illusion of separate selfhood that had driven all his seeking, recognizing the awareness that had been present all along. "I see," he exclaimed, his voice filled with wonder and joy. "The dust has been removed from my eyes, and the truth is clear. What you have taught is not mere philosophy, but living reality. The path you describe leads exactly where you have said it would lead." The other four, witnessing their companion's transformation and feeling the shift in consciousness that had occurred through the night of teaching, found their own understanding deepening and clarifying. One by one, they too began to taste the freedom that the Buddha's words had pointed toward, recognizing in their own experience the truth of what they had heard. As the sun climbed higher, bringing full daylight to the deer park, the Buddha realized that his first teaching mission had succeeded beyond his hopes. These five sincere seekers had become his first disciples, the foundation of what would grow into a community of awakened beings dedicated to sharing this liberating understanding with all who were ready to receive it. The wheel of Dharma had begun to turn, carrying within its revolution the potential to transform human consciousness on a scale that none of them could yet imagine. From this small grove in an ancient park, teachings would eventually spread across continents and cultures, offering hope and healing to countless beings who struggled with the same fundamental questions that had once driven a young prince from his palace. But in that moment, as the Buddha sat surrounded by his first five disciples in the gentle light of early morning, the magnitude of what lay ahead remained hidden. What mattered now was the simple joy of sharing truth with open hearts, of witnessing the awakening that occurred when beings recognized their own inherent freedom. The great work of compassionate teaching had begun, and with each moment of understanding that passed between teacher and students, the possibility of universal liberation grew brighter. The sounds of the waking park provided a natural symphony for this historic moment. Birds welcoming the dawn with songs of celebration, streams murmuring their eternal wisdom, leaves rustling with the gentle breath of morning breezes. All of nature seemed to recognize that something significant had occurred, that a new chapter in the story of human awakening had been written in the space between one night and the next morning. As the five new disciples prepared to dedicate their lives to practicing and sharing what they had learned, the Buddha felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal achievement. The understanding that had come to him beneath the Bodhi tree was not meant to be hoarded as a private treasure, but to be given freely to all who hungered for liberation. In the awakening of these 5 sincere seekers, he saw the first ripples of what would become an ocean of compassionate wisdom touching every shore of human experience. The morning stretched ahead with infinite possibility, each moment pregnant with opportunities to deepen understanding and extend the circle of awakening. The Buddha rose from his seat beneath the tree, ready to continue the great work that would define the remaining decades of his life, knowing that what had begun in this sacred grove would continue to unfold in ways that would bring comfort and guidance to beings not yet born, in times and places not yet imagined. The first teaching was complete, but the teaching itself would never end, flowing like water from teacher to student, from generation to generation, carrying within its current the eternal promise that suffering could be understood, transcended, and transformed into the boundless compassion that was every being's birthright and deepest nature. The years that followed the Buddha's first teaching at Sarnath witnessed the gradual emergence of something unprecedented in human history, a community of awakened beings dedicated to the systematic exploration and sharing of liberation. What began with 5 sincere seekers in a quiet grove would expand into a movement that touched the lives of kings and peasants, scholars and simple villagers, each finding in these teachings a path suited to their own capacity for understanding. As word of the Buddha's awakening spread along the ancient trade routes that connected distant regions, seekers began arriving at the deer park from across the known world. Some came driven by intellectual curiosity, having heard rumors of a teacher whose wisdom surpassed that of the established masters. Others arrived bearing the weight of personal suffering, hoping to find relief from losses that seemed unbearable. Still others were drawn by something they could not name, a subtle calling that pulled them toward this gathering of beings who seemed to radiate an unusual quality of peace. Each new arrival brought their own story of seeking, their own pattern of confusion and hope. The Buddha received them all with the same patient attention he had shown his first 5 disciples, recognizing in each face the same fundamental questions that had once driven him from his palace. Yet his approach to teaching proved remarkably flexible, adapting to the needs and understanding of each individual while never compromising the essential truth he sought to communicate. To those caught in extreme wealth, he spoke of the freedom that came from simplicity and contentment with basic necessities. For those trapped in grinding poverty, he offered teachings that revealed the richness of awareness itself, a treasure that external circumstances could never touch. The intellectually sophisticated received instructions that satisfied their need for logical understanding, while those of simpler disposition found practices that spoke directly to their intuitive wisdom. Among these early disciples was a young merchant named Yasa, whose story would become emblematic of the Buddha's ability to reach beings from all walks of life. Yasa had inherited a prosperous trading business from his father, possessing wealth that should have guaranteed happiness according to conventional wisdom. Yet, despite his material success, he found himself plagued by the same existential restlessness that had once troubled Prince Siddhartha. One evening, after a particularly lavish celebration in his honor, Yasa awoke to find his house filled with sleeping servants and entertainers, their bodies scattered about in positions that suddenly seemed to him like a preview of death itself. The sight filled him with such revulsion for the emptiness of his luxurious existence that he fled into the night, wandering aimlessly until dawn brought him to the edge of the deer park. There he encountered the Buddha during the early morning meditation period. sitting in perfect stillness beneath the same tree where the first teaching had been given. Something in the awakened one's presence immediately calmed Yasa's agitated mind, and when the Buddha opened his eyes and smiled with infinite compassion, the young merchant felt as though he had finally found what he had been unconsciously seeking his entire life. The teaching that followed was unlike anything Yasa had ever experienced. Rather than offering complex philosophical arguments or demanding blind faith in religious doctrines, the Buddha simply invited him to examine his own experience with clarity and honesty. Through gentle questioning, he helped Yasa recognize how his dissatisfaction arose not from his external circumstances, but from his mind's constant craving for experiences that could never provide lasting fulfillment. As understanding dawned in Yasa's consciousness, he felt the same liberation that had transformed the 5 original disciples. The burden of trying to find happiness through accumulating pleasures and possessions suddenly seemed absurd, like someone searching desperately for something they were already holding in their hand. In that moment of recognition, he joined the growing community of beings who had discovered the freedom that came from understanding the nature of their own minds. Yasa's transformation had profound ripple effects throughout the region. When his friends and family members came searching for him, fearing he had been harmed or kidnapped, they too encountered the Buddha's teachings and found themselves drawn into the circle of awakening. His parents, initially distraught at their son's apparent abandonment of worldly responsibilities, discovered that his newfound wisdom made him more loving and helpful than he had ever been before. This pattern repeated itself countless times as the community grew. Rather than creating isolated individuals who withdrew from the world, the Buddha's teachings seemed to produce beings who engaged with life more skillfully and compassionately than ever before. Their awakening did not separate them from others, but connected them more deeply to the fundamental humanity that all beings shared. As the monsoon season approached, bringing with it the traditional period when wandering teachers settled in one place for intensive practice and study, the Buddha established what would become the prototype for all future Buddhist monasteries. The generous donations of early disciples provided simple shelters and basic necessities, creating a space where the serious study and practice of liberation could flourish without the distractions of constant travel. During this first retreat season, the Buddha refined his teaching methods through daily interactions with disciples, whose understanding ranged from beginning glimpses of truth to profound realizations that approached his own. He developed a systematic approach to instruction that would become known as the gradual teaching, leading students step by step from their current level of understanding toward ever deeper insights. The foundation of this approach was the cultivation of ethical conduct, not as a rigid set of rules imposed from outside, but as the natural expression of wisdom that saw the interconnected nature of all existence. Students learned that actions motivated by greed, hatred, and delusion created suffering not only for others, but for themselves, while actions rooted in generosity, compassion, and clarity generated happiness and peace that rippled outward in ever-expanding circles. Upon this foundation of ethical living, the Buddha built increasingly sophisticated meditation practices that developed the mind's natural capacity for concentration and insight. Students learned to work skillfully with their breath, using this most basic life process as an anchor for awareness that could remain stable even in the midst of difficult emotions or challenging circumstances. As their concentration deepened, disciples discovered that the constant chatter of mental commentary that had once seemed so important was actually a kind of background noise, that obscured their natural clarity and peace. In the silence that emerged as this mental noise subsided, they began to perceive the workings of their own consciousness with unprecedented precision and understanding. The insights that arose from this clear seeing confirmed everything the Buddha had taught about the nature of suffering and its resolution. Students observed directly how their minds created dissatisfaction through constant wanting and rejecting, how the sense of being a separate self was actually a construction built from temporary thoughts and sensations, and how the peace they sought was not something to be achieved, but something to be uncovered by removing the obstacles that obscured it. These realizations were not merely intellectual understanding, but transformative experiences that permanently altered how disciples related to themselves and their world. Fear decreased as they recognized that what they truly were could never be threatened or damaged. Anger subsided as they saw through the illusion of separation that made others seem like enemies. Craving diminished as they discovered the contentment that was available in each present moment. Yet perhaps most remarkably, these profound personal transformations seem to increase rather than decrease their capacity for engagement with the world's suffering. As their own inner conflicts resolved, disciples found themselves naturally drawn to help others who still struggled with the same difficulties they had transcended. Their awakening became not an escape from the world, but a deeper entry into compassionate service. During the quiet months of that first retreat, the Buddha also began training his most advanced disciples in the art of teaching itself. He recognized that the liberation he offered could only spread as far as there were skilled teachers capable of transmitting it accurately and compassionately. The task of awakening humanity was too vast for any single individual, no matter how realized. The training of teachers required extraordinary precision, for the Buddha understood how easily profound truths could be distorted when filtered through the limitations of partial understanding. Students learned not only what to teach, but how to recognize the readiness of different individuals for various levels of instruction. They practiced adapting the presentation of eternal truths to the cultural contexts and personal circumstances of diverse audiences. Most importantly, they learned to teach primarily through the quality of their own presence, rather than through clever words or impressive displays of knowledge. The Buddha emphasized that the most powerful teaching was the natural radiance of a mind that had found genuine peace, and that such authentic presence could communicate truth more effectively than the most eloquent speeches. As the retreat season drew to a close, and the community prepared to resume their wandering life of teaching, the Buddha surveyed what had been accomplished with deep satisfaction. From the initial 5 disciples, the Sangha had grown to include several dozen fully awakened beings, and many more who had achieved significant levels of understanding and liberation. These disciples would now scatter across the known world, carrying with them not just intellectual knowledge about the path to freedom, but the living embodiment of that freedom itself. Each would become a seed of awakening, capable of nurturing others toward their own realization and creating communities where the systematic cultivation of wisdom and compassion could flourish. The Buddha's own teaching mission would continue for 4.5 more decades, but already the foundation had been established for something that would far outlast his physical presence. The Dharma had taken root in human consciousness, and like a great tree whose seeds are carried by the wind to distant places, it would continue to grow and spread long after its original source had returned to the silence from which it had emerged. As the first rains ended and the community prepared for their next phase of wandering teaching, the Buddha stood once more beneath the tree where his first discourse had been given. The deer park stretched peacefully around him. Its ancient trees witnessed to the transformation that had occurred within their shelter. Animals moved through the underbrush with their natural grace. Streams continued their eternal murmur, and the cycle of days and seasons flowed on as it always had. Yet something fundamental had changed in the world. A new possibility had been born into human consciousness, a path that led from the seeming inevitability of suffering to the reality of perfect peace. The seeds of this transformation had been planted not through force or coercion, but through the simple sharing of truth with open hearts. And like all living seeds, they carried within themselves the potential to reproduce endlessly, spreading their gift of awakening to every corner of human experience. The Buddha smiled as he prepared to resume his journey, knowing that what had begun in the privacy of his own awakening beneath a Bodhi tree had now become a living river of wisdom that would flow through countless generations. The great work of compassion had found its rhythm, and with each step forward, the possibility of universal liberation grew ever brighter. The monsoon clouds gathered overhead, heavy with the promise of rain that would nourish the earth and prepare it for new growth. In this natural cycle of seasons, the Buddha saw a perfect reflection of the spiritual seasons that governed the awakening of consciousness. There was a time for planting seeds through teaching, a time for the patient cultivation of understanding through practice, and a time for the harvest of realization that transformed ordinary beings into sources of light for others still wandering in darkness. As the first drops of rain began to fall, blessing the earth with the moisture that made all life possible, the Buddha and his disciples set forth once again into a world that was subtly but permanently changed by their presence. The wheel of Dharma continued to turn, carrying within its revolution the hope of liberation for all beings who suffered, and the promise that the peace they sought was not a distant dream, but their own deepest nature, waiting patiently to be recognized. The years that unfolded after those first monsoons carried the Buddha's teachings into territories both geographical and spiritual that none could have foreseen. As his community of awakened disciples dispersed along the ancient pathways connecting kingdoms and cultures, each carried within themselves a living flame of understanding that would kindle countless other lights in the gathering darkness of human confusion. Among the most remarkable of these early missions was the journey undertaken by two senior disciples to the kingdom of Magadha, where King Bimbisara ruled with a wisdom that had already earned him recognition as one of the most enlightened monarchs of his age. This king had heard whispers of the Buddha's teaching carried by merchants and travelers, and something in these fragmented accounts stirred a longing within his heart that all his royal privileges had never satisfied. The disciples arrived at Bimbisara's court during the festival season, when the capital city blazed with lights and resonated with music that celebrated the kingdom's prosperity. Yet even amid this splendor, the king found himself drawn to the quiet presence of these wandering teachers, whose simple robes seemed to outshine all the silk and gold that adorned his palace. In the privacy of his royal chambers, away from the elaborate protocols that governed public audiences, King Bimbisara listened with growing amazement as the disciples shared the teachings they had received directly from the Buddha's lips. Here was wisdom that addressed the very questions that had haunted him despite all his worldly success. How could a ruler govern justly when every decision seemed to create both benefit and harm? How could one find genuine peace while bearing responsibility for the welfare of thousands of subjects? The teaching that most profoundly touched the king's heart concerned the nature of true authority. The disciples explained that real power came not from the ability to control external circumstances, but from the freedom that arose when one was no longer controlled by internal reactions of greed, hatred, and confusion. A ruler who had found such inner freedom would naturally govern with the wisdom and compassion that served the highest good of all. As understanding dawned in the king's consciousness, he experienced a transformation that would echo through the political and spiritual landscape of his entire kingdom. The burden of kingship, which had once felt like a crushing weight of impossible responsibilities, revealed itself as an opportunity for the expression of awakened compassion on the largest possible scale. King Bimbisara's conversion to the Buddha's teachings created ripples that spread far beyond his own personal awakening. When word reached the Buddha of the king's transformation, he recognized an unprecedented opportunity to demonstrate how spiritual wisdom could transform not just individual lives, but entire societies. The prospect of a kingdom governed by dharmic principles represented a possibility that could serve as a model for human civilization itself. The Buddha's journey to Magadha became a pilgrimage that attracted thousands of seekers from across the known world. Villages emptied as people walked for days to catch a glimpse of the awakened one whose teachings had transformed their king. The roads leading to the capital became rivers of humanity, flowing with merchants and farmers, scholars and ascetics, all united by a shared hunger for the truth that promised liberation from the endless cycles of suffering that had defined human existence for millennia. The teaching that the Buddha offered in Magadha addressed this vast and diverse audience with a skill that seemed to multiply his presence across countless individual hearts simultaneously. Speaking to the assembled multitudes in the great courtyard of the royal palace, he wove together stories and insights that reached both the sophisticated philosophical understanding of learned Brahmins and the simple, direct wisdom of village farmers who had never learned to read. He spoke of a great wheel that governed all existence, turning eternally through cycles of birth, growth, decay, and death. But unlike the fatalistic interpretations that had led so many to passive acceptance of suffering, the Buddha revealed this wheel as something that could be understood and ultimately transcended through the application of wisdom and compassion. Every being caught upon this wheel, he explained, was there not by the decree of distant gods or the cruel indifference of fate, but by the natural consequences of their own actions and intentions. This was not a punitive system designed to inflict suffering, but a perfectly just arrangement that ensured every deed, whether skillful or harmful, would eventually bear its appropriate fruit. The profound implications of this teaching struck the assembled crowd like lightning illuminating a darkened landscape. If their current circumstances were the result of past actions, then their future could be shaped by present choices. The poverty that seemed like an unchangeable burden could be transformed through generous action. The anger that poisoned relationships could be healed through the cultivation of patience and understanding. Most revolutionary of all was the recognition that even the cycle of birth and death itself was not an eternal prison, but a temporary condition that could be transcended through the complete understanding of its workings. Liberation was not just a beautiful dream for future generations, but an achievable reality for anyone willing to apply the teachings with sufficient dedication and skill. As the days of teaching continued in Magadha, miraculous transformations began occurring throughout the kingdom. Long-standing disputes between villages dissolved as former enemies recognized their shared participation in the web of cause and effect that connected all beings. Merchants who had built their wealth through exploitation began redistributing their resources to benefit those they had previously wronged. Perhaps most remarkably, the very atmosphere of the kingdom seemed to shift towards something more harmonious and peaceful. Travelers noted that the people they encountered radiated an unusual quality of contentment and kindness. Children played with less aggression. Adults conducted business with greater honesty. And even the animals seemed more gentle and trusting in their interactions with humans. King Bimbisara, witnessing these transformations throughout his realm, became one of the Buddha's most devoted supporters. He donated vast tracts of land for the establishment of monasteries, where the serious study and practice of liberation could flourish without interruption. These communities became centers of learning that attracted scholars and practitioners from distant lands, creating an international network dedicated to the exploration of consciousness and the cultivation of wisdom. Yet the Buddha remained careful not to allow his teaching to become identified too closely with any particular ruler or political system. When other kings, jealous of Bimbisara's evident success and happiness, invited the Buddha to their own kingdoms with offers of even greater wealth and privilege, he accepted their invitations while maintaining the same simple lifestyle that had characterized his mission from its beginning. In the kingdom of Kosala, ruled by King Pasenadi, the Buddha encountered a different set of challenges that tested his ability to communicate liberating truth across cultural and philosophical boundaries. This realm was dominated by Brahmins, whose elaborate ritual systems and complex theological debates had created a spiritual landscape quite different from the more practical concerns that had characterized his teaching in Magadha. The learned Brahmins, who initially came to test the Buddha's understanding, arrived armed with sophisticated philosophical arguments and scriptural quotations designed to expose what they assumed would be the limitations of this self-proclaimed teacher. They had spent decades mastering the intricacies of religious law and metaphysical speculation, and they approached this encounter with the confidence of experts examining an amateur. What they discovered instead was a depth of understanding that surpassed their most advanced theoretical knowledge, while remaining grounded in direct experience rather than scholarly speculation. The Buddha's responses to their questions revealed not just intellectual mastery, but wisdom that flowed from the living source of awakened consciousness itself. When they challenged him with complex theological puzzles about the nature of the soul or the mechanics of cosmic justice, the Buddha redirected their attention to the immediate reality of suffering and its resolution. Rather than engaging in abstract debates that could continue endlessly without reaching any practical conclusion, he invited them to examine their own experience and discover for themselves the truths that no amount of theorizing could adequately capture. This approach initially frustrated the Brahmins, who had devoted their lives to the elaboration of increasingly sophisticated conceptual systems. Yet gradually, some among them began to recognize that their vast learning had actually become a barrier to the direct understanding they claimed to seek. Their minds had become so filled with other people's ideas about truth that they had lost touch with their own capacity for immediate recognition. One of the most learned among them, a Brahmin named Bharadvaja, whose knowledge of scripture was legendary throughout the kingdom, experienced a particularly profound awakening during one of these encounters. After hours of debate, in which every argument he raised was gently but decisively resolved by the Buddha's wisdom, he found himself sitting in stunned silence as the entire edifice of his intellectual identity crumbled. In that moment of complete conceptual collapse, something unprecedented occurred. The awareness that had been seeking truth through endless accumulation of knowledge suddenly recognized that it was itself the truth it had been seeking. All the scriptures he had memorized, all the rituals he had mastered, all the philosophical positions he had defended, were revealed as elaborate detours away from the simple recognition of his own awaken nature. The transformation of such a prominent Brahmin sent shockwaves throughout the intellectual establishment of Kosala. If someone of Bharadvaja's stature and learning could abandon the traditional path in favor of the Buddha's teachings, what did this mean for the entire system of religious authority that had governed the kingdom for generations? Some Brahmins reacted with increased hostility, viewing the Buddha as a dangerous revolutionary whose influence threatened the social order that supported their privileged position. They organized campaigns to discredit his teachings and limit his access to potential students, using their considerable political influence to create obstacles for the growing community of practitioners. Others, however, recognized in the Buddha's approach something that their own tradition had perhaps lost over centuries of increasing complexity and ritualization. They saw his teaching not as a rejection of their spiritual heritage, but as a return to its essential heart, stripped of the accumulated layers of interpretation and elaboration that had obscured its original clarity. King Pasenadi himself found his kingdom increasingly divided between these competing perspectives on spiritual authority and religious truth. His own heart was drawn to the Buddha's teachings, which addressed his personal struggles with greater effectiveness than all the elaborate ceremonies and theological consultations he had previously relied upon. Yet as a ruler, he felt responsible for maintaining the stability that came from honoring the traditional structures that had governed his people for countless generations. The challenge of integrating revolutionary spiritual insights with established social systems became one of the defining issues of his reign, requiring a wisdom and skill that tested every aspect of his leadership. The Buddha's response to this delicate situation demonstrated his remarkable ability to navigate complex political and cultural dynamics without compromising the essential integrity of his message. Rather than demanding that existing institutions be abandoned wholesale, he worked patiently to transform them from within, showing how ancient wisdom traditions could be renewed through contact with living truth. To the Brahmins who remained hostile, he offered no arguments or counterattacks, but simply continued to embody the peace and clarity that their own scriptures proclaimed as the highest goal of spiritual life. His very presence challenged them to examine whether their elaborate knowledge was actually producing the fruits of wisdom that it claimed to cultivate. To those Brahmins who showed genuine openness, he revealed how their traditional practices could be understood and applied in ways that led to direct realization rather than mere intellectual satisfaction. The sacrificial rituals that had become empty formalities were shown to represent profound truths about the nature of selfless service. The meditation techniques that had been reduced to mechanical repetition were restored to their original purpose as doorways to awakened consciousness. Most skillfully of all, the Buddha worked with King Pasenadi to develop new forms of governance that honored both the wisdom of tradition and the insights of awakened consciousness. Laws were crafted that reflected understanding of the interconnected nature of all existence, creating systems of justice that aimed at healing and restoration rather than mere punishment. The kingdom's resources were gradually redirected towards supporting the conditions that allowed all beings to develop their potential for wisdom and compassion. Education systems were established that combined practical skills with spiritual understanding. Economic policies were implemented that reduced the extreme disparities between rich and poor that created so much social tension and individual suffering. These innovations required years of patient development, with the Buddha serving as both spiritual guide and practical advisor to a transformation process that had no historical precedent. Never before had a society attempted to organize itself around principles derived from direct spiritual insight rather than the inherited assumptions of tradition or the arbitrary preferences of rulers. The results, while gradual, were remarkable enough to attract attention from kingdoms throughout the known world. Delegations arrived from distant lands to study what they had heard described as a realm where justice flowed from wisdom rather than force, where prosperity was measured by the happiness of all citizens rather than the accumulation of wealth by a privileged few. Yet even as these external successes multiplied, the Buddha remained focused on the internal transformation that made such achievements possible. In his private teachings to the king and his closest advisors, he emphasized that no social system, however skillfully designed, could create genuine happiness for beings who had not yet discovered the source of happiness within their own consciousness. The true revolution he offered was not political but spiritual, not a rearrangement of external circumstances, but a fundamental shift in how consciousness related to whatever circumstances arose. A society of awakened beings would naturally create harmonious institutions, but institutions alone could never create awakened beings. This understanding guided the Buddha's approach as his teaching mission expanded to encompass an ever-widening circle of kingdoms, cultures, and communities. Each new context presented unique challenges and opportunities, requiring fresh applications of eternal principles while never compromising the essential message that liberation was available to every being willing to undertake the journey from ignorance to understanding. The stories of transformation that emerged from these various missions began to take on a mythical quality, spreading along trade routes and pilgrimage paths to inspire seekers in lands where the Buddha himself would never physically travel. Merchants carried tales of kingdoms where suffering had been dramatically reduced through the application of dharmic principles. Wandering ascetics shared accounts of communities where former enemies had become allies through the recognition of their shared Buddha nature. These stories planted seeds of possibility in countless hearts, creating a longing for the same transformation that had blessed the fortunate beings who had encountered the Buddha directly. The ripples of awakening began to spread beyond the immediate circle of his physical presence, carried by the natural human desire to share whatever brought genuine happiness and peace. As the Buddha entered the later years of his teaching career, he could look back on 4 decades of compassionate service that had fundamentally altered the spiritual landscape of the known world. Millions of beings had heard his teachings directly or through his disciples. Thousands had achieved various levels of awakening. Hundreds had become fully liberated teachers capable of guiding others toward the same realization. Yet perhaps his greatest achievement was not the number of individuals he had helped, but the demonstration he had provided that human consciousness itself contained unlimited potential for wisdom, compassion, and peace. The very existence of his awakening proved that the suffering which seemed so inevitable was actually optional, that the peace which seemed so distant was actually the very nature of awareness itself. This proof had been written not in philosophical treatises or theological arguments, but in the transformed lives of ordinary human beings who had discovered their own extraordinary nature. Kings and beggars, scholars and farmers, young and old, men and women from every conceivable background had found in his teachings a path that led reliably from confusion to clarity, from conflict to harmony, from despair to unshakable joy. The Buddha's final years were spent consolidating this vast network of awakened beings into a self-sustaining community capable of preserving and transmitting the Dharma long after his physical form had returned to the elements from which it arose. He trained teachers to train other teachers, established institutions that could outlast individual lifespans, and created systems for maintaining the purity of transmission across generations and cultures. Most importantly, he clarified that the ultimate teacher was not any external authority, but the awakened nature that existed within every being's own consciousness. His teachings were not meant to create dependence on his person or his words, but to point each individual toward the source of wisdom that could never be lost or damaged by external circumstances. As his 80th year approached, the Buddha's body began showing signs of the aging process that affects all conditioned existence. Yet those who were close to him observed that his mind remained as clear and compassionate as ever, undisturbed by the physical changes that were simply another teaching about the impermanent nature of all phenomena. His final months were spent in gentle wandering through the regions where his teaching had taken deepest root, offering last instructions to communities that had been transformed by decades of dharmic practice. These farewell discourses carried a poignancy that moved even his most advanced disciples to tears, yet they were filled with the same wisdom and compassion that had characterized every moment of his awakened life. The Buddha's approaching departure from the world he had served so faithfully became itself a profound teaching about the nature of attachment and letting go. Even his most devoted disciples had to confront their own clinging to his physical presence, learning to find the teacher within themselves that could never be separated from them by death or any other circumstance. In the quiet grove where he chose to spend his final days, surrounded by disciples whose lives had been forever changed by his presence, the Buddha offered his last words of guidance to a world that would continue to need the light of Dharma long after his voice had fallen silent. The wheel he had set in motion would continue turning, carrying its promise of liberation to countless beings not yet born, in times and places not yet imagined. As the Buddha's earthly journey drew toward its close, he made one final pilgrimage through the lands where his teachings had taken root most deeply. Each village and monastery he visited became a sacred way station in what his disciples understood would be their last opportunity to receive direct guidance from the source of their awakening. In the small town of Pava, where merchants gathered to trade goods carried along the ancient routes connecting distant kingdoms, the Buddha accepted an invitation to dine with Kunda, a humble metalworker whose simple devotion had earned him recognition among the local community of practitioners. This meal, prepared with loving care despite Kunda's modest means, would become his final offering of earthly nourishment. As they shared this simple feast, the Buddha spoke with gentle warmth about the true nature of generosity. The food that sustained the body, he explained, was far less significant than the open heart from which it was offered. Kunda's gift was precious, not because of its material value, but because it flowed from the wellspring of compassion that connected all beings in their deepest humanity. Shortly after this meal, the Buddha began experiencing the physical discomfort that would mark his final illness. Yet even as his body weakened, his mind remained luminous with the same clarity and kindness that had characterized every moment of his awakened life. When his attendants expressed concern about his condition, he reassured them with words that carried the authority of one who had long ago transcended all fear of death. The journey continued to Kusinara, a quiet grove where ancient trees created a natural cathedral for what would become the Buddha's final teaching. As word spread that the awakened one was preparing to leave his physical form, disciples arrived from across the known world to receive whatever wisdom he might still impart to those who would carry his message into future generations. Lying peacefully between two sala trees, whose flowers had bloomed unseasonably, creating a canopy of white petals that drifted down like gentle snow, the Buddha gathered his closest disciples for final instructions. His voice, though weakened by illness, carried the same musical quality that had captivated countless hearts throughout his teaching career. The essence of his message remained unchanged from that first discourse in the deer park decades earlier. All conditioned existence was subject to change and dissolution. Suffering arose from the mind's resistance to this fundamental truth. Liberation was possible through understanding and accepting the impermanent nature of all phenomena. The path he had outlined provided reliable guidance for any being sincere in their desire for freedom. Yet now these familiar teachings carried additional weight, for they were being demonstrated through the Buddha's own graceful approach to death. Here was the ultimate test of whether his insights could truly bring peace in the face of life's greatest uncertainty. His disciples watched with profound attention as their teacher embodied the very liberation he had spent his life describing. As the night deepened around their small gathering, the Buddha's breathing became more labored, yet his expression remained serene. Between periods of rest, he continued offering guidance to disciples who hung on every word, knowing these precious moments would soon pass into memory. To Ananda, his devoted attendant who had served faithfully for over 20 years, he offered particular comfort. This gentle soul had dedicated his life to caring for the Buddha's physical needs, often sacrificing his own spiritual development to ensure that nothing interfered with the teaching mission. Now, as tears flowed down Ananda's cheeks, the Buddha assured him that such selfless service was itself a form of the highest practice. The younger monks, still struggling with attachment to their teacher's physical presence, received instructions about finding the refuge that could never be taken away by death or any other circumstance. The Buddha reminded them that his true body was not this aging collection of flesh and bone, but the Dharma itself, the living truth that had awakened in his consciousness and could awaken in theirs. To the assembled lay practitioners who had traveled great distances to be present for these final hours, the Buddha offered encouragement about continuing their spiritual development without dependence on external teachers. The path was clear, the practices were established, and the community of fellow seekers would provide mutual support for anyone genuinely committed to liberation. As dawn began to touch the eastern horizon with its first pale light, the Buddha called for any final questions from those who had gathered around his resting place. The silence that followed was profound, not because no questions existed, but because his entire life had been such a complete answer that words seemed inadequate to the moment. With infinite gentleness, the Buddha spoke his final teaching to the world he had served with such dedication. All conditioned things were impermanent, he reminded them once more. This was not a cause for despair, but the very foundation of freedom. Understanding impermanence deeply was the key to liberation from suffering. His last words carried the practical wisdom that had always characterized his approach to spiritual instruction. Work out your salvation with diligence, he advised, emphasizing that liberation was not a gift to be received passively, but an achievement that required sustained effort and sincere commitment from each individual seeker. As these words dissolved into the morning air, the Buddha's consciousness withdrew from the physical form that had housed it for 80 years. The transition was so peaceful that several moments passed before those present realized that the great teacher's earthly mission had reached its completion. There was no struggle, no apparent pain, only the natural dissolution of what had always been temporary. The grief that arose among his disciples was profound, yet strangely mixed with gratitude. They had witnessed something unprecedented in human history, a being who had achieved perfect liberation and then dedicated his entire awakened existence to helping others achieve the same freedom. His death was not a defeat, but a final demonstration of the very impermanence his teachings had always embraced. Word of the Buddha's passing spread along the same trade routes that had once carried news of his awakening. Kings abandoned their royal duties to participate in funeral ceremonies that honored not just a great teacher, but the possibility of human perfection that his life had proven. Merchants closed their shops, farmers left their fields, and scholars emerged from their libraries to join processions that seemed to include every stratum of society. Yet even as mourning rituals unfolded across the known world, something remarkable began to manifest. The Dharma that the Buddha had embodied and taught did not die with his physical form. Instead, it seemed to take on a life of its own, spreading through the hearts and minds of practitioners with renewed vigor and clarity. His disciples discovered that their teacher's most profound gift had not been his physical presence, but his success in awakening their own capacity for wisdom and compassion. The refuge they had sought in his person was revealed to exist within their own consciousness, as accessible and reliable as he had always promised it would be. The monastic communities he had established became centers of learning that attracted seekers from increasingly distant lands. The texts that preserved his teachings began to be copied and translated, carrying his insights across linguistic and cultural barriers that had previously seemed insurmountable. The practices he had refined through decades of experimentation proved effective for beings whose circumstances differed dramatically from those of his original disciples. Within a generation, the Buddha's influence had spread far beyond the geographical boundaries of his physical teaching mission. Kingdoms that had never heard his voice began implementing governmental policies based on dharmic principles. Merchants conducted trade according to ethical guidelines derived from his instructions. Families raised children using methods that honored the Buddha nature present in every young heart. The transformation was not always smooth or immediate. Different cultures interpreted his teachings through the lens of their own traditions and assumptions, sometimes creating variations that would have surprised their original source. Political leaders occasionally attempted to use dharmic language to justify actions that contradicted its essential spirit of nonviolence and compassion. Yet through all these adaptations and occasional distortions, the essential message remained intact. Suffering was not inevitable. Liberation was possible. The path forward had been clearly marked by one who had traveled it completely. These truths proved as relevant to beings living centuries after the Buddha's death as they had been to his original disciples. The stories of his life began to take on legendary qualities, inspiring countless generations of seekers who found in his example proof that ordinary human consciousness contained extraordinary potential for transformation. The prince who had renounced a kingdom to seek truth became a symbol of the spiritual courage required to question inherited assumptions and pursue deeper understanding. His years of extreme asceticism served as a warning about the dangers of spiritual materialism, while his discovery of the middle way offered guidance for finding balance in all aspects of life. His awakening beneath the Bodhi tree demonstratement was not reserved for that enlightened special few, but was the birthright of every being willing to look deeply into the nature of their own experience. Perhaps most importantly, his 4 decades of teaching showed that awakening was not meant to be a private achievement, but a gift to be shared with all who suffered. The Buddha's life proved that the highest realization naturally expressed itself through compassionate service to others still trapped in the cycles of confusion and pain. The communities that formed around his teachings became laboratories for exploring how awakened consciousness could transform not just individual lives, but entire societies. Monasteries developed sophisticated systems for training the mind and heart, while lay practitioners discovered ways to integrate spiritual principles into family life, business relationships, and civic responsibilities. These experiments in dharmic living produced innovations that influenced fields far beyond what we might consider religious practice. Medical systems emerged that treated illness as an opportunity for understanding the relationship between mind and body. Educational approaches developed that honored both intellectual development and spiritual growth. Art forms arose that used beauty as a vehicle for transmitting liberating insights. The Buddha's emphasis on direct experience over blind faith encouraged a spirit of inquiry that contributed to advances in philosophy, psychology, and even early forms of scientific observation. His insistence that teachings be tested in the laboratory of personal practice created traditions of empirical investigation that would influence human knowledge for millennia. Yet through all these practical applications, the heart of his message remained wonderfully simple. Every being possessed the capacity for perfect peace and unlimited compassion. This potential could be realized through patient practice and sincere dedication. The benefits of such realization naturally flowed outward to bless all life. As centuries passed and the Buddha's teachings spread across continents he had never seen, encountering cultures he could never have imagined, this simple truth continued to prove its universal relevance. In mountain monasteries and bustling cities, among scholars and laborers, in times of peace and periods of conflict, human beings discovered that the path he had outlined led reliably toward the freedom he had promised. The wheel of Dharma that began turning in that first teaching at Sarnath continued its revolution, carrying its message of hope and healing into every corner of human experience. Each new practitioner who achieved even a glimpse of liberation became another spoke in that wheel, helping to maintain its momentum across generations and cultures. The Buddha's physical presence had been limited to a specific time and place, but the awakening he embodied transcended all such boundaries. His death marked not an ending, but a transformation. As his insights took root in countless hearts and began flowering in ways that reflected the unique gifts and circumstances of each individual who embraced them. Tonight, as these ancient stories drift through your consciousness like leaves floating on a gentle stream, remember that they speak not just of events from a distant past, but of possibilities that remain eternally present. The same Buddha nature that awakened in a prince sitting beneath a tree in ancient India exists within your own awareness at this very moment, waiting patiently for the recognition that could transform your understanding as completely as it transformed his. The peace he discovered is not locked away in historical texts or confined to monastery walls. It flows as naturally as breath through every moment of ordinary experience, available to any being sincere in their desire for freedom from the habits of mind that create unnecessary suffering. As sleep begins to claim your consciousness, let these stories of awakening and compassion settle into the deeper layers of your being. Allow them to plant seeds that may blossom in dreams or in the quiet moments of tomorrow's dawn, reminding you that the liberation sought by countless generations of seekers is not a distant goal, but your own essential nature, temporarily obscured but never truly lost. The Buddha's final teaching continues in the rising and falling of your breath, in the natural awareness that witnesses all experience without being disturbed by it. in the compassion that spontaneously arises when you recognize your deep connection to all life. Rest now in this understanding, letting the wisdom of ages carry you into the profound peace that has always been your birthright, your deepest nature, your true home. And so our journey through these timeless stories draws to its natural close, like the gentle settling of evening mist upon still waters. Tonight, you have walked alongside princes and peasants, teachers and seekers, witnessing the eternal dance between suffering and liberation that defines the human experience. These tales from Buddhism's sacred history remind us that transformation is not merely possible, but inevitable for those who dare to look deeply into the nature of their own hearts. From Siddhartha's awakening beneath the Bodhi tree to the countless disciples whose lives were forever changed by encountering truth, we see that the path to peace is not reserved for the exceptional few, but lies open before every being who yearns for genuine freedom. The same Buddha nature that flowered in ancient India continues to pulse quietly within your own consciousness, waiting patiently for the recognition that could illuminate your entire existence. As these stories settle into the deeper chambers of your being, let them serve as gentle companions on your own journey toward understanding. May the wisdom they carry bless your dreams with profound rest. And may you awaken tomorrow with the quiet knowing that the peace you seek is not somewhere distant, but resting eternally in the very awareness that is reading these words right now. Sleep well, dear friend, held in the same compassionate embrace that has comforted countless souls across the ages. Make sure you like, comment, and share this video with someone who you wish peace on.